They called it Ash Wednesday. Throughout Egypt, British officials began to destroy sensitive documents as their enemies advanced.
In Cairo, the Egyptian capital, the British feared the worst. The Germans seemed likely to take the city, just as they'd already conquered most of Europe. In the Pacific, the Japanese had gravely weakened British and American power and taken Hong Kong and Singapore. In the Atlantic, German submarines threatened to starve Britain into submission. It was the darkest moment in the Second World War.
Few of the British servicemen were professionals. Ever since Dunkirk, they had had to learn their new trade in the hard school of defeat. This series follows their struggle to turn back the tide of disaster through 4 campaigns on the road to victory, starting in the deserts of North Africa. The Germans had come to North Africa the year before to defend their Italian allies in Libya. But now their aim was to take Egypt, and with it the whole of the Middle East. And in Rommel, the German commander, they had sent one of their best generals, as the British had discovered to their cost.
Rommel was a man who exploited every situation. He led from the front. He was most of the time in the front with his soldiers. And we were against a very professional army, a very good army, and very well equipped, better equipped than we were.
For the battered British soldiers, fighting Rommel in the desert became a struggle against nature as much as the enemy.
This is a field of battle like no other. The desert is a harsh and waterless place. Living in it soaks up water. Travelling through it soaks up petrol. And for the inexperienced or unprepared, the whole environment soaks up resolve.
Simply surviving here is an effort in itself.
The ration was 2 water bottles per day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, 2 pints. And that had to do for everything. It had to do for drinking, for washing of clothes, everything.
With no real landmarks, finding your way in safety is difficult.
Because in the wilderness you didn't know where you was. And of course the living conditions were more primitive than we'd ever known. And you know, talk about Boy Scouts camping, it's no comparison, of course.
Perhaps the most obvious thing about the desert was, to the men who fought here, the most peculiar. There were no civilians and almost no buildings to get in the way. Put simply, desert fighting was a tactician's dream.
And in Rommel, the British were facing a master tactician. In 1942, the German commander was hoping to knock Britain right out of the war. His plan was to smash through the British army and take Egypt and the Middle East, and with it the oil supplies which kept the British war effort going. The British line rested on the coast at Gazala. Rommel swung his massed tanks round the desert flank of the Allied line and pushed in towards the British rear. His attack smashed into the disorganized British. Their tanks were split up in small units and unable to stop the German advance.
I watched the Germans come over this ridge. And we've been told that the Germans had very little tanks. And I thought, well, I don't know where they've got all the tanks from, but somebody's given us wrong information here.
it was chaos. It was chaos. I mean, I'm being honest about that. We suddenly found ourselves surrounded, and we were ordered to break out in transport, every vehicle for itself. The 8th Army was in retreat.
We really believed, and we were made to believe, that we had held all the aces. And then it all went wrong. And it's very hard then.
Broken British units raced back along the coast to Egypt. Some of them found themselves overtaken by the advancing Germans.
And we went through German positions. When they realised that what was happening, started firing at us, and we were going through crossfire to get out. When we eventually got back, there was only enough men to form one company out of 2 companies. I must admit, we probably thought, well, this could be the end.
The headlong British retreat continued for 300 miles deep into Egypt.
The lack of obstructions in the desert meant that movement along the Mediterranean coast was astonishingly fast. Because the desert had no value in itself, vast areas of it could be given up in order to buy time.
The front line now was just 60 miles from the Nile. Back in Cairo, the panic began.
GHQ was beginning to muster papers, and there were things being destroyed, and I mean there was a certain amount of preparation for what might happen if we lost the front.
And in the Egyptian bazaars, the rumours ran rife. Many Egyptians were unhappy with British domination and looked forward to a German victory. The British knew that information was reaching the Germans. In every alley, there might be enemy sympathisers. Behind each shop front, perhaps a spy. As the retreat continued and the situation got worse, the Commander-in-Chief sacked the army commander and took charge himself. His name was Claude Auchinleck. He was a soldier of huge experience and great tenacity. As the battered British and Commonwealth units arrived, he ordered them to take up defensive positions near an obscure railway halt called Alamein. This would be the last line of defense before the Nile Delta. The Alamein position was the strongest natural barrier in the Western Desert, for it was impossible to outflank. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. From there, the British line stretched south for 30 miles, where it rested on another impassable barrier.
I'm standing right on the edge of the Qattara Depression, which falls away 200 feet below sea level into a sea of shifting sand, passable to a few camels, but a showstopper for a Second World War army. If Rommel was going to attack, he'd have to break the British line. All this was closed to him.
In fact, the position at Alamein had been known to the British for some time. Auchinleck had had the area fortified in depth well before Rommel's offensive. To avoid being seen by air patrols, the British dug deep, and these fortifications were so solid that traces of them still survive.
So this is where the broken 8th Army rallied, with some of its units taking up position in concrete emplacements like this. I think this one has been some sort of headquarters. It's well tucked into the desert, and it's littered with rusty oil and petrol cans. In front, there were deep minefields. Behind, Auchinleck had massed the army's artillery, ready to pour concentrated fire onto the Germans when they attacked.
With its back against the wall, the 8th Army just held out at Alamein. It had not been beaten, but it had been shaken. Some of the soldiers had been fighting here for more than 2 years, and many were exhausted. Partly, it was due to the tough conditions in the desert. Out here, there were precious few home comforts for the troops.
I can't ever remember when we were actually in the line when you have a proper meal. When you'd open a tin of a can of bully beef, of course, it sort of half floated out the can because the heat had melted all the fat that's in there. And you used to get these very hard biscuits, and half of them was left over from the 1914 war.
And there'd be flies round you before you say Jack Robinson. You have a brew. In fact, you couldn't drink it without flies settling on it, so you were muzzling, you know. That bad.
You'd sort of boil over all through the day, and then when at night time you couldn't wrap yourself up enough to keep warm.
The desert sores, that was another problem. If you knocked yourself, which was inevitable on a tank, as soon as you knocked yourself at all, it became festered within a matter of hours, and it spread like an ulcer.
The soldiers began to distrust the High Command, which seemed unable even to provide them with adequate equipment.
We knew, you see, we knew that the tanks we had were not really up to scratch. We couldn't match the German tanks. And we kept on asking, and we couldn't understand that each time we got new tanks, they had this silly little pea shooter, as we called it. The inevitable result would be that we'd suffer, and we'd lose a lot of people.
Most of all, it was failure that demoralised them. After months in the desert, they'd shown that they were as tough as their enemies. But despite that, their operations had not been successful.
It seemed that their generals had let them down. And now there were signs that for some of them, it was all becoming too much. Many officers had taken to questioning orders. Others had been relieved because of exhaustion. Commonwealth troops often distrusted British officers. Infantry was suspicious of armour. Brave but baffled was how the Prime Minister Winston Churchill described them. And now it was time for him to take a hand.
The Prime Minister flew to Egypt to see things for himself. He wasn't pleased with what he found. He urgently needed a victory, and Auchinleck was adamant that there could be no offensive until at least September. A visit to the front left him even more depressed. The next day, he acted. A new commander-in-chief was appointed. He was General Sir Harold Alexander, a charming and steady warrior with a reputation for calm efficiency. And there was a new commander for the 8th Army too, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. His task was to destroy the Afrika Korps and throw Rommel out of Africa. Rommel was still hopeful of a final victory, a victory which might even be a war winner. Far away in Russia, the German armies had reached the Caucasus. From there, they might be able to threaten Persia and Iraq. Combined with a desert thrust through to Cairo, such a move might still give Hitler control over all the oil in the Middle East and knock Britain out of the war. But Rommel was a long way from his bases and short of supplies. Worse, British attacks at sea were interrupting the convoys from Italy. If he was going to make a move, he knew he had to do it soon. Rommel's new opponent swept into his task like a tornado. Arriving in Egypt 2 days before he was supposed to take over, he took off for the desert almost immediately and began issuing orders.
There will be no further.
A veteran of the Western Front in the First World War, Montgomery had a reputation for prickliness and insubordination, but also as a consummate professional, dedicated to the art of war.
Our mandate from the Prime Minister is to destroy the Axis forces in North Africa. It can be done, and it will be done, beyond any possibility of doubt.
Nobody had ever seen an army commander in person in a field of conflict. And you couldn't help but be inspired.
We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead. I want to impress on everyone that the bad times are over. They are finished.
For the baffled soldiers of the 8th Army, there was now at least some certainty about the future. A fortnight after Montgomery took over the British Army, Rommel made his move. He gathered his armoured forces and punched at the southern end of the British line, moving them by night towards a ridge called Alam Halfa.
It was down this track that Rommel moved the hundreds of vehicles of the Afrika Korps that night. Although the walls of the escarpment on either side prevented the British on the ground from seeing it, this huge concentration of armour was desperately vulnerable to air reconnaissance, and the RAF spotted it.
Montgomery's army was expecting them. Both military logic and intercepted signals had predicted the attack. Monty knew that the battle at Alam Halfa would be crucial. If he lost, he was finished, and so was the 8th Army. This was to be a purely defensive battle. There was to be no wild armoured charge into the German ranks. Montgomery thought that too many tank officers were still cavalry soldiers at heart. They hadn't learnt the lessons of armoured warfare.
The senior officers had led cavalry charges because that's the way they did it. And we as tank men who'd been trained to use ground and hold down positions, we were appalled at the tactics of draw cutlasses or sabres and charge. And we kept doing this. And we kept losing.
Rommel's aim was to smash his way over the Alam Halfa ridge, to emerge behind the bulk of the British Army and push on towards Cairo.
The Germans advanced with soft-skin vehicles as well. They had staff cars and people like that, reconnaissance, sometimes motorcycles as well, you see. And behind them, the body of tanks, which you can identify by the amount of dust they raise.
Once he knew the direction they were taking, Montgomery gave the final orders for the tanks to plug the line.
We were told to hold our fire till the last minute, virtually. Suddenly, the guns opened up. And then flames, people bailing out, machine guns shooting down. general panic, a halt, people trying to get away, tanks withdrawing. Obviously, a lost cause. What must have been for them quite horrific. But very pleasing from my point of view. It was the first time I'd been in a shooting gallery shooting at the target instead of being the target.
Having halted Rommel's advance, Montgomery called in the power of his artillery and air force. They battered the German columns for days on end. Eventually, Rommel withdrew. Montgomery had his victory. And for the troops, the victory brought a new confidence in the future. Perhaps Rommel could be beaten, once and for all.
The fact that that was successful had an enormous effect on us, because we felt, right, this is now working for us. Then there's no reason why we shouldn't do it anywhere else.
The dominance of the Desert Air Force at Alam Halfa shocked the Germans, and it was a promise of things to come. Slowly, the British won command of the air.
And the big change came when our Spitfires arrived. And the first thing we heard was, with our little radios, we were able to often pick up the German planes. And we heard a German voice saying, "Achtung, Spitfire." And the Spitfires then arrived. The climate changed, as you can imagine. And we all cheered each time the Spitfires came over and did their stuff. And we were able to walk in the sunlight from then on.
With Rommel's attack halted, the British began the build-up for the coming offensive. 300 tanks and an extra 30,000 men arrived in Egypt. Just the sight of all the supplies and reinforcements was exhilarating for the old desert hands.
At last, the things you'd asked for were being delivered. And then you saw Sherman tanks with 75mm all-round Travers. This was another army. And the whole desert was covered with vehicles and guns and moving up.
In 2 months, Montgomery was ready. He had 200,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks. Rommel had less than half that. Along the whole of the 35-mile front, for months, both sides had been laying anti-tank mines in front of their positions, in fields several miles deep. Today, it's still a lethal landscape. Hundreds of mines left over from the fighting litter the battlefield, nearly 60 years on.
These minefields were an overriding factor in Montgomery's calculations. They formed an invisible barrier which vehicles couldn't cross. But there was another way. If he couldn't send tanks, he could send men. Their weight wouldn't explode the mines. Appropriately enough, he called his plan Lightfoot.
Montgomery's plan was a complex one, involving thousands of men. To ensure that everyone knew what part they would play in the coming battle, he began a program of addressing the troops.
Well, he arrived, and was really quite a small chap, but asked for something he could stand on and talk to everybody.
Now, my forecast of this battle is that there will be 3 definite stages. First, the break-in.
You knew he was in command, there's no doubt about it, and you didn't tend to drop your gaze if he was looking at you or look away somewhere else. You were held by him.
Then, the dogfight. I believe that the dogfight battle will become a hard killing match and will last for 10 or 12 days.
He made people believe in that, you know, this was going to be it, and everything would be planned to the last detail.
The enemy will crack. Then will come the breakout. And that will lead to the end of Rommel in Africa.
All in all, what Montgomery was proposing was essentially a First World War battle, like those fought on the Western Front, where he himself had learnt his trade. The infantry would advance into no man's land, while the artillery barrage kept the defenders' heads down. Unlike so many battles in the First World War, this one was carefully prepared and slickly coordinated. But when it began, everything would depend on the power of the British guns.
Montgomery fixed the date for the 23rd of October. All day his soldiers lay concealed in the desert, waiting for night when the battle would start. Although he risked confusion in the dark, Montgomery hoped to catch his enemy by surprise.
It was very dark then. It was just before the moon. You could see in the eastern skyline the oncoming moon beginning to light up a bit. But you knew, because you'd rehearsed it all, that everything was happening. You could hear the soft crunch of sand behind you, as that was, you knew which company that was and where they were going to their location. It was a thoughtful period. You knew that tonight was going to be the real stuff. I don't think anybody would be human if they didn't go through a bit of panic. We had our thoughts about our families and our friends, and always a man will think, well, if it happens to me, well, it happens to me. But at least I hope that when it does, I won't be suffering. I'll have done my bit. It was such an enormous barrage. The whole of the eastern skyline behind us was a ripple of light from one end to the other end. Must be 650 guns they were firing. And then the next moment, you were hearing the whistling away overhead and then the crump away out in front of us on the German lines. Must have cured any constipation they had.
It was the biggest British bombardment since the First World War.
You didn't hear anything coming back from the enemy of that sort of volume. It was spasmodic firing. It was the firing of people who had been caught unawares.
After 20 minutes of the barrage, the leading troops, in this sector, Highlanders of 51st Division, began to advance slowly, in extended line, into the minefield. Their objective was the crest of that low ridge called Miterea, on the horizon. Behind it were Axis tanks and guns. In front of it, the enemy infantry, with rifles and machine guns, bayonets and grenades, were dug in and behind the minefield.
They walked towards the enemy at a steady march, just behind the barrage, which moved slowly forward in front of them. Despite the moonlight, the dust and smoke obscured almost everything. To guide them, the artillery fired tracer shells to mark the route, and behind them, searchlights pierced the sky to create landmarks.
And these two beams dropped down to be above our heads, and they crossed like that. To us, it was the cross of St. Andrews. Your other noise that you'd all been listening for, the company pipers. They were there, and we knew that we were the Highland Division going into battle. When we finally reached the German lines and went looking for Germans, and the only ones we found had already got their hands stretched above their head in surrender.
For Montgomery's plan to succeed, it was vital that clear lanes were marked out through the minefields, not just for the tanks, but for transport vehicles, so that the infantry could bring up ammunition and supplies.
We must have probably been about halfway across no man's land before the barrage started. And we was out there in no man's land, and you felt very, very, very lonely.
Each mine had to be identified, checked and lifted.
The sand was quite easy to move away. You just use your hands. You just felt your way around it. You'd been trained out what these mines were like, what they felt like in the dark even. If there was a German teller mine, the fuse is on the top and has a pin attached to it. You push the pin in, you unscrew the top off it. That mine was safe then. Yeah, it's a tense moment, but you know you've got to do it because the infantry people are relying on you to give a clear passage for the heavy equipment to come through.
When the engineers had finished, the tanks moved forwards in the narrow lanes. The tanks would emerge from the minefields before dawn broke to await the German counterattack. At least, that was the plan.
We started through the minefield, got to the second minefield. The infantry had missed a lot of anti-tank guns, and we came under intense anti-tank fire. And we lost 31 tanks. And we got orders to cease action, discontinue, disengage, withdraw. Awful situation, because a good anti-tank gunner will take the first tank out and the last one, and you can't get forward, you can't get back. You can only go into the minefield and risk being blown up. You probably lose the track. Once you lose your tracks, you're a sitting target anyway, because you can't move at all. So you're just hoping it's not you that's going to be hit. It's a terrible feeling.
As dawn broke on the morning after the attack, it was clear that the army had not, in fact, achieved its objectives. Montgomery's gamble had not paid off. But now he held his nerve. And it was one of those moments in military history when nerve really counted. He knew that his force was larger, better equipped, and had more air support. He could afford a battle of attrition, and Rommel couldn't. He took one of the toughest decisions that a general has to face: to accept the loss of men's lives in a tough slogging match to bring about victory. The battle would continue.
After all, we managed to do it at Alan Halfa, so of course we could do it here. It was only a matter of throwing more people in, I'm afraid.
It worked in this way that wherever there was a weakness in the enemy defences, the troops would move forward, sometimes 100 yards, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. But edging forward, you were crumbling at the defences, so all the time the pressure was on them.
Rommel had been on sick leave. He returned to find his deputy dead, his army under continuous heavy bombardment with little air cover. As ever, he was short of fuel. At one point, his army had only 3 days' supply of petrol. Day after day, for 10 long days, Montgomery's dogfight went on. Along the whole of the front, the fighting continued under the desert sun. Indians and Australians, British and South Africans picked away at the German and Italian positions, taking prisoners here, gaining ground there. The dogfight led to one of the most heroic actions of the battle. On the night of the 27th of October, under the by now usual barrage, the men of the 2nd Rifle Brigade moved forward, bringing with them 19 anti-tank guns. They were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Vic Turner. His objective was a place called, for want of a better name, Snipe.
This is it. Just a patch of churned-up desert on the forward slope of a low ridge. They arrived after dark and began to reconnoitre the surrounding area.
They had walked into a hornet's nest.
Just north of us, about 1,000 yards away, was a tank leaguer of over 30 German tanks.
They made an attack about 7 a.m. 6 pounds were doing the work. Without them, I mean, we'd been annihilated. As the crews bailed out of their tanks, whoever survived, we'd be shooting them down like rabbits. Now, so the shelling during the day and night was out of this world.
As the riflemen fought on, the shells hurtled down on their position. Several times that day, they were bombarded by their own side.
We got the hell of a time from our own 105mm guns. And of all the unpleasant things in a very unpleasant day, I think that was the most unpleasant.
The Germans attacked the British at Snipe all day in waves, even penetrating behind the British lines.
I looked at the rear, about 200 yards to my rear, there was a German Mark III. And I said to the lads, I said, blimey, a German tank there. I thought, Christ, he's seen us now, you know, we've had it now. And the next thing I heard was this explosion. And then I smelt burning rubber and all that. I looked back and this tank had been knocked out.
By the end of the day, Turner's 19 guns had destroyed perhaps 50 armoured vehicles. Turner himself received the Victoria Cross, and many of his men were also decorated. The real value of the Snipe fighting lay in its contribution to the wearing down of Rommel's armour. He had 77 serviceable tanks left. Montgomery had 900. It was time for the breakout.
Again, the British guns roared out in the darkness. Again, the infantry set off across the desert, spraying enemy positions with small arms fire, lobbing grenades into their trenches. But this time, the going was easier.
After a while, the Germans started retreating. Because what you've got to understand is that those Germans have been under terrific bombardment, and their nerves must have been in a terrible state I mean, the bombardment that was laid down to support us was tremendous. We couldn't do nothing wrong, not with that sort of support. And we carried on for 4 miles, right until we got to our objective.
The 10-day dogfight had paid off. Now it was time for the armoured assault that Montgomery's army had worked so hard for.
We got through the minefields and broke into the open ground. And then, from my point of view, it was purely a question of going forward and attacking. This was going to be tank warfare as we'd done before, and we had a lot better tanks. We had the Aces for one. The battle raged then. It was just a personal thing then. You lost sight of what was happening. It was just you fighting whatever was there.
The Axis troops began to pull back, despite a message from Hitler saying that there would be no retreat. Rommel's forces were decimated.
I was still a bit sceptical because I'd fought Rommel for a long time, and there were times before when we thought we defeated him. But when I saw the devastation and the knocked out tanks and some of the most modern supercharged Mark IVs with the 75mm gun on destroyed, and the anti-tank guns and the dead and the prisoners, columns of prisoners, I thought, no, I can't see these going to recover.
This was what everyone had been waiting for. Montgomery moved his army forward across the desert as fast as was safe, in pursuit of his fleeing enemies. The pursuit took the army back along the Mediterranean coast, over all the battlefields of the past 2 years, and on towards the capital of Italian Africa, Tripoli. As they pushed on, they had some dramatic news. At the other end of the Mediterranean, a huge British and American fleet had appeared off the coast of the French colonies of Morocco and Algeria. They were to land another army in Rommel's rear. There was now no hope for the Africa Corps. And so, 3 months to the day after the Battle of Alamein began, British and Commonwealth forces entered Tripoli. They had achieved the aim they had set themselves so long ago. The success brought a new spirit to the 8th Army.
There had been a tremendous build-up of pride in the army. The 8th Army title became to be known as something that you wanted to be in. It had risen from almost obscurity into this newborn army. So it meant a lot to people.
Today, the desert is almost as empty as it was before the fighting. The train still chugs up the railway line twice a day. There's more irrigation and a few more people. But it's very hard to imagine that nearly 60 years ago, There were hundreds of thousands of men and machines packed into this little corner of the desert on that October night.
Nevertheless, here they were, sweating in the heat and cursing the flies. Despite grievous losses, the brave but baffled men of 8th Army had won a famous triumph. This great citizen army of brickies and barristers, teachers and taxi drivers had come of age. As Churchill put it, before Alamein, there were almost no victories. After it, there were no defeats. Small wonder that bells pealed out across Britain at the news.
Elation. Somehow the signals had got on to the London radio end, and we heard this amazing sound coming all that distance from London into the desert.
Of the men who made up John MacGregor's battalion of the Black Watch, almost 1/3 became casualties at Alamein.
You all know that if you're a soldier, your life's on the line. But when you take stock, it was a heavy toll for one unit. It became a very personal thing. And a bringing down to earth of elation, elation at a cost.
D-Day Dodgers out in Italy, always drinking vino, always on the spree. 8th Army skivers and the Yanks, we live in Rome, we laugh at tanks, for we're the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy.
In the summer of 1944, British troops in Italy were accused of shirking the war effort. MP Nancy Astor claimed that they were having a paid holiday, while the real fighting was going on in Normandy.
The men in Italy should have been bitter, but most were too tired to care. They'd just spent 4 months throwing themselves against an extraordinary German defensive position for a questionable victory. They'd toiled up mountainsides, baked by the sun and buffeted by wind and snow. They'd forded freezing rivers and marched through miles of mud. Italy was anything but a holiday.
It was always a controversial campaign. After victory in North Africa, the Allies were split over where to attack Fortress Europe. Churchill finally persuaded the Americans to keep up the pressure on the Germans in Italy. The Allies swept through Sicily and on to the mainland. The demoralized Italians surrendered soon after the first troops landed. It looked like being a short campaign. But Italy is a cruel country for invaders. Sheer mountains form its spiny backbone. Rivers block the line of advance. For the young men sent to fight here, it was a punishing place that would push them to the limits of their endurance.
It was unbelievable. Always raining or snowing or sleeting. One was permanently sopping wet.
German opened fire. Everything they had they put on us. Artillery, machine guns, everything. It was like being in the middle of lightning.
And then the machine gun bullets sweeping over one's head, and sometimes, of course, not always over the head. We lost a lot of men.
The Germans made the Allies struggle for every mile. The advance stopped at Cassino.
On the 15th of January 1944, weary soldiers of the Fifth Army dislodged the Germans from the top of this mountain, Monte Trocchio. They'd fought all the way up from the south, and the last 7 miles alone had cost them 16,000 casualties. As the men hauled themselves up to the crest, they must have been appalled by what they saw across the valley. The Germans were snug, in an apparently impregnable defensive position.
They had complete mastery of the road to Rome, which ran up the centre of this valley. To advance north, the Allies would either have to make a dash through the gap or storm the mountain strongholds.
The worst of the Italian campaign was still to come.
Surveying the whole scene was a great monastery, which would become the haunting symbol of the war in Italy, Monte Cassino.
It was such a vast building, and it dominated everything. And it did have that slightly eerie feeling of looking at you the whole time.
It seemed as though it was looking down on you because it was in such an overpowering position up there.
The clouds broke suddenly, and you could see the monastery 5 miles away, perched up on the top of this incredible cliff, dominating everything.
It was here that Hitler's commander in Italy made a stand for the winter. Field Marshal Kesselring, nicknamed Smiling Albert, created a formidable blockade that stretched across Italy from coast to coast. He called it the Gustav Line. The Germans blasted bridges and roads to slow down the Allied advance. They felled hundreds of trees to improve their observation. And they mined the whole area.
Particularly repellent was this vicious little shoe mine. It's made of wood with just the minimum of metal parts to make it hard to find with a mine detector. It contains just enough explosive to blow off a man's foot. The cruel logic of this was that a crippled soldier imposed far more of a burden on his own side than a dead one. There were thousands of these scattered all around Cassino.
They made the best use of every bit of rock, of cranny, of caves, and they knew the tracks which we had to use, and they covered all those tracks, both with machine gun fire and shelling as well.
The Germans dug themselves deep into the hillside.
Unless they got a direct hit, they were safe down in these tunnels.
German ingenuity improved on nature on the slopes above Cassino. This artificial cave is still littered with the fins of British mortar bombs. But the cave is so cunningly sited, scooped into the very back of a ridge, that there was just no chance of these being fired into it.
The Germans even had the weather on their side. January 1944 brought one of the worst Italian winters that locals could remember. The advance foundered in the mud.
At night it was dark, cold, wet and miserable. We had no cover of any kind. Of course, there were no things like tents or anything.
It was either snowing or blowing or raining, and it was a very, very cold time.
The interminable misery of life on the front line was a world apart from the more measured pace of Allied headquarters. The Allied commander-in-chief in Italy was a British officer, General Sir Harold Alexander. He had made his headquarters at the King of Naples' palace at Caserta, an hour's drive from the Gustav Line. This elegant atmosphere was a reflection of the man himself.
Harold Macmillan, British resident minister out here, commented that the conversation at Caserta was more likely to be about classical architecture or the best way of driving pheasants in low country than about the war. Charming and popular, Alexander was a good choice to command the troops of a dozen nations who served under him in Italy. Macmillan wrote admiringly that he didn't give orders, but made suggestions. This relaxed, easygoing style was a great strength and a great weakness.
Alexander couldn't control his American subordinate, General Mark Clark, commander of Fifth Army. Clark was aggressive and vain. His personal ambition was a flaw that would affect his military judgment. The distrust between these two men mirrored a wider Anglo-American divide over the whole worth of the Italian campaign. To the Americans, it was a sideshow, wasting men and ammunition. To the British, the struggle was occupying German troops who might otherwise be free to fortify Normandy. The Allies were pulling against each other, and this discord was to have terrible consequences. Churchill knew it was imperative to break the deadlock. He revived an ambitious plan for an amphibious landing at the little ports of Anzio and Nettuno. From there, the Allies could threaten the Gustav Line from behind. It will astonish the world, and it will certainly frighten Kesselring, Churchill declared.
For a soldier, an amphibious landing by night is a risky business. Time and tide are crucially important, and bad weather can wreck things before the enemy even fires a shot. Troops are desperately vulnerable when they hit the beach, and thereafter they must depend upon the sea for resupply and reinforcement.
26-year-old Edward Grace was in one of the leading craft approaching Anzio.
We expected to get a right royal reception from the Germans. All the machine guns would open up at once as we approached the beach, and no doubt there would be a heavy artillery fire coming right down onto the navy, the ships, and also, no doubt, some of the shells landing right on top of us on the beach.
Fresh in the minds of the men heading for Anzio was the memory of the near disaster at Salerno the previous September. There, the Germans had lunged back instantly and almost pushed the Allies into the sea. But this time, the Germans should have their hands full on the Gustav Line.
Just before the Anzio landing, they were to be distracted by an attack miles away on the Gustav Line. General Clark ordered his battle-scarred 36th Division, a Texas outfit, to cross the River Garry, 2 miles south of Cassino, and break into the valley beyond. The men had to make the crossing in lightweight assault boats made of wood and canvas. They constructed them at a safe distance from the river.
The night of the 20th of January was wet and foggy. The Texans had to carry their boats almost 2 miles across a flooded minefield under shell and mortar fire. Then they had to paddle across the river, gain handholds on the far bank, and hang on until the engineers built bridges. The Garry may not look much of an obstacle, but it's deep and fast-flowing, especially when swollen by winter rains. Alarmingly, the Texan commander, Major General Fred Walker, privately thought that the mission was hopeless.
He wrote in his diary,
"We might succeed, but I don't see how we can. The crossing is dominated by heights on both sides of the valley, where German observers are ready. Clark sent me his best wishes. I think he is worried over the fact that he made an unwise decision."
Clark was right to be worried. 900 Americans never even made it to the water. Some boats were damaged and sank. Others capsized as the men climbed in. A few were swept helplessly away.
I could hear the paddles slapping water and hitting together, and then the men yelling when their boat turned over. It curdled your blood to hear those men drown.
Amazingly, some of them made it across here, in boats, swimming, or on footbridges which were soon smashed. In the morning, the survivors sheltered in irrigation ditches or flooded foxholes. The Texans tried again that afternoon, but it was the same dreadful story. Eventually the Germans, horrified by the scene, stopped firing and stacked the bodies up like driftwood. The Texas Division lost nearly 1,700 men. It was a write-off.
Many Texans never forgave General Clark. One company commander told the reporter,
"I had 184 men. 48 hours later, I had 17. If that's not mass murder, I don't know what is."
The diversion at Cassino had failed to pin down the Germans on the Gustav Line. Now the men approaching Anzio were at risk.
At last we could feel the crunch of the ship touching the sand underneath, and the ramps came down, and then I, as the officer of the platoon, jumped into the water.
Edward Grace and his men waded to the beach, bracing themselves for the first burst of machine gun fire.
There was nothing but darkness, and there was no sound at all.
The men pushed on into the scrub beyond the beach. Still there was nothing.
And then at last there was one single German soldier came running down without any weapons, and of course we captured him and asked him. He was very polite. He spoke half English and half German, and he explained to us that all his battalion had been moved, and he was left behind because he was repairing a couple of broken-down vehicles.
The Germans had been completely outmaneuvered. The landing was a spectacular success. Alexander telegraphed Churchill, promising that the American beachhead commander, General John Lucas, would push quickly inland. Churchill replied, "I'm very glad you are pegging out claims rather than digging in beachheads."
But General Lucas wasn't pegging out claims. He was confused by contradictory instructions. Alexander wanted him to push inland and threaten German communications with the Gustav Line. There'd even been talk of capturing Rome. But at the last moment, Clark warned him, "Don't stick your neck out, Johnny. I did it at Salerno and nearly got my head cut off." So Lucas decided to be cautious and built up men and vehicles.
We thought, why couldn't we have marched on in those first 2 days straight to Rome? There seemed to be no opposition whatsoever. We might just as well have sent the Germans a postcard.
On the third day, 30,000 Germans surrounded the beachhead. All the advantage of surprise had been lost, and the sacrifices made in the attacks on the Gustav line were wasted. Lucas kept unloading for a full week. He didn't attempt to advance until he'd assembled 70,000 men. Only now, they faced 95,000 Germans.
The Allies were trapped and would remain so for months to come. Churchill was furious. "I expected to see a wild cat roaring through the mountains, and what do I find? A whale wallowing on the beaches." The Americans even threatened to pull out of Italy altogether. The crisis galvanized Alexander and Clark into action. Both their reputations were at stake. Clark knew he had to keep up the pressure at Cassino to stop the Germans moving even more troops to Anzio. He dared not risk another attack in the valley. He had to take control of the high ground and the monastery itself. He ordered another American division, the 34th, to fight its way onto the Massif and capture Monastery Hill. It was an order that must have struck dread into the hearts of the men.
And from here we can see just how the monastery dominates everything around it. A single observer up there could bring artillery fire down on any possible Allied approach. To the men overlooked by it, the monastery took on a sinister fascination.
You had the feeling it looked at you, and you had no idea how many people were inside looking at you as well. So you did your best to keep it out of view.
What appeared to the Allies as a malevolent fortress was in fact an internationally important religious site. St. Benedict had founded a monastery here in the 6th century, choosing a lofty site for protection. Only he had chosen too well. Its commanding position had made it a target for every passing army for 1,000 years. Now it lay at the heart of the Gustav line, with guns pointing at it from all directions.
The Germans were acutely sensitive about the monastery. They'd recently been accused of cultural vandalism when they publicly burnt books from a great library at Naples, and now they had the perfect opportunity to restore their reputation. Though there was more to it than that. The local German commander was a devout Roman Catholic. The Germans declared a 300-yard neutral area around the monastery, which the Allies agreed to respect.
The Americans now had the thankless task of trying to capture the hill without damaging the monastery itself. By the 4th of February, they'd fought their way onto this ridge, known as Snake's Head. It curved round in a boomerang shape towards the monastery, but the route to it was formidable. It was a place that 20-year-old John Buckridge would never forget.
On one side of the ridge was this sheer drop down into the valley, and on the other side were these great clefts, these great cuts in the rock where you just couldn't go. I mean, you had to be on the top, and the flat bit was quite narrow, really.
During the day, the Americans were pinned down by mortar and machine gun fire. Each night, half frozen and reeling with fatigue, they were expected to attack blindly uphill towards the Germans.
There are limits to what flesh and blood can stand, and the number of Americans up here dwindled day by day. There was no hope of reinforcement. All other Allied divisions were at full stretch, at Anzio or against the Gustav line.
Nothing left in them, in fact, to get on any more. And if they had been asked to get on an attack again, I don't think they had the energy to do it.
Alexander couldn't afford to ease up the pressure on the Germans, so he brought in fresh troops from his other army in Italy, the 8th. His multinational force included New Zealanders and Indians, as well as French, North Africans and Canadians. The experienced 4th Indian Division would replace the Americans on the ridge. It's difficult to imagine the sufferings of men existing up here on the Massif. They couldn't dig into the rock, so they built these stone shelters. The British called them sangars. It was freezing cold, often snowing or raining. And although these gave some protection from German weapons, they gave little against the weather. During the hours of daylight, men were prisoners up here, unable to put their head over the top without being shot.
The sangars that we took over from the Americans were probably not more than 12 inches or 18 inches high, barely high enough for a person to sit up without their heads protruding over the top, as we were soon to discover, because soon after first light, one of my corporals was shot in the head by a sniper from a ridge about 400 yards away across a valley. And within the morning, my own batman sitting with me in my own sangar was shot and killed.
John Buckridge's divisional commander was Major General Francis Chuka, an outspoken man with a genuine concern for his men. Chuka looked closely at what his men were being asked to do. They had to attack uphill astride this razorback ridge. On one side it drops away sharply over a precipice, on the other it's deeply etched with ravines. It's barbarous country, and Chuka knew his men would be massacred. Chuka believed attacking the monastery head-on was a desperate mistake. He badgered his senior commanders to cut through the mountains north of Cassino, to sever the German supply route. Although the terrain was even more difficult, it suited the mountain skills of his Indian troops and the Moroccan goumier of the French army. But Chuka was ignored. His men would still have to attack the monastery. To improve their odds, he decided to do a little private research. He wanted to find out more about the layout of the building, which he believed the Germans were occupying. One afternoon, Chuka drove down to Naples and spent a few hours browsing in the bookshops. Eventually, he found what he was looking for: a book on the construction of the monastery, published in 1879. What he read convinced him that there was only one way of dealing with that mighty fortress with its 10-foot thick walls. That evening, he fired off a memo to his superior, demanding that the monastery should be bombed off the face of the earth. It was a highly controversial request, and it brought Alexander and Clark head-to-head. Clark, whose decision it was, opposed the bombing because he wasn't convinced that there were Germans inside. But Alexander made it clear that Clark's first duty was to support his men. Clark was forced to back down or be humiliatingly overruled. The all-seeing eye would be put out. The bombing was set for the 16th of February, when a break in the bad weather was predicted. Beforehand, the Allies dropped leaflets over and around the monastery, warning the monks to leave. It was the news most dreaded by the monastery's frail 80-year-old abbot, Gregorio Diamari. Nothing in his 35 peaceful years of prayer and study in his mountain eyrie had prepared him for the horror of being in the middle of a war zone. The Germans had forced all but 5 of his monks to leave. But in recent weeks, the monastery had been overrun by hundreds of terrified civilians in search of sanctuary. They were starving and dying by scores from some virulent disease. And now their sanctuary was about to become a tomb. Abbot Diamari asked the Germans for help and was told his flock would be guided to safety on the night of the 15th. But it was the morning of the 15th that an ominous sound was heard.
we could hear a droning in the sky, and we looked up, and we saw a great horde of American flying fortresses coming our way.
The American Air Force, taking advantage of the good weather, had gone a day early. But they hadn't told anybody. The consequences were disastrous for the refugees.
We saw the bomb doors open and the bombs coming down. The whole ground shuddered under the great weight of these bombs coming down. Great clouds of dust and smoke came up from the monastery building, and now and again saw great bits of them kind of going into the air as a result of an explosion. And it really was very frightening.
In the ruins of the monastery lay 200 dead, many of them women and children. The abbot, carrying a cross, led the shell-shocked survivors into German lines.
When all the smoke had cleared and all the dust had cleared, this very regular sort of building had been reduced to ruins with jagged walls, with gaping holes. But the foundations at the very bottom still appeared to be absolutely intact.
The bombing hadn't been heavy enough to completely obliterate the monastery. Instead, it had turned it into a labyrinth of ruins, ideal for the German defenders. The Germans occupied it immediately, making the monastery an armed fortress. There could be no more heavy bombing, because it would endanger the men of the Royal Sussex Regiment, who had to follow up with a ground attack. But because the air raid had gone early, they weren't ready. That night, John Buckeridge and a company of just 66 men launched themselves at this...
We just couldn't stay there. We hadn't done it. We couldn't do it. We just couldn't get on.
After the second night, the Royal Sussex was cut to half its strength. All General Chuka's fears about the folly of attacking along the ridge had been justified. But the commanders wouldn't give up. It was the turn of the Gurkhas. Gordon Shakespeare, a 23-year-old officer, had no time to study the terrain.
It was a complete ring of fire that came at us as we moved down to the start line. Apart from that, grenades and mines, anti-personnel mines, S-mines, tripwires. The whole area was festooned with them.
As the Germans opened fire, one Gurkha company made for the only cover, a patch of scrub. It was booby-trapped, and the first men tripped a string of grenades. Half the leading platoon was blown up, others were caught in withering machine gun fire.
There was no question of surprise or anything. The Germans knew we were coming. Some just got through, but the majority of them were stopped. And casualties were so heavy that it wasn't worth going on.
Alexander called off the ridge attack, saying that he didn't want another Passchendaele. But Cassino had become a haunting reminder of the Western Front of 1917. Relentless attacks, blasted landscape, and human misery.
Monte Cassino now dominated the minds not only of the men who lived beneath its shadow, but also of their commanders. It seemed to blind them to the reality of what they were asking men to do. The next attack would go straight up the mountain. First, the attackers would have to take Castle Hill, just behind me. Then they'd work their way across the front of the mountain to Hangman's Hill, that rocky outcrop on the left. Only when they'd got that could they attack the monastery itself.
Sergeant Bill Hawkins, who'd spent 3 years in North Africa, now had to make the climb of his life.
Making our way up the Castle Hill, You can understand with the hills strewn with boulders and thickets, and in the dark, it was raining, the shell fire was terrific, and the sniper fire was continuous. It was a difficult climb, but we were all sort of pleased that once we'd got up there, we was inside the castle.
The castle itself was a vital link in the chain leading up the Massif. It was viciously counterattacked by German paras.
The paratroops, one of Hitler's elite forces, had just been sent to strengthen the casino defences. They had instructions to hold the line, whatever the cost.
They had the grenades with the long wooden handles, and they could throw them quite some distance, but they were throwing them up to drop in the castle. If we wanted to shoot at those, you've got to put your head up and look over the top of the wall and look down, and that was when you put yourself in a position of somebody shooting you anyway. It was a difficult place to defend, really.
The battle took on the fury of a medieval siege. The Essex fired so many mortar bombs that the red-hot barrels began to melt. Then the paras got right up to the castle wall and laid explosives.
They blew down part of the wall, burying more than 20 men of the Essex Regiment. Then they burst into the courtyard and fought hand to hand.
The battle for Castle Hill reached a new level of ferocity.
There was casualties lying all over the ground outside. There was New Zealand, German, Gurkha, British.
But it was also the scene of a curious old-fashioned gallantry. In the middle of the battle, the Germans asked for an armistice to collect casualties.
The stretcher bearers from both sides, German and our own, went out and collected in the wounded from outside the castle walls. We had approximately 14 or 15 German prisoners in the castle, and some of these volunteered to go out with our stretcher bearers and bring in the wounded.
The Essex Regiment had held the castle, but they could get no further.
We thought we were up high, but the monastery was much, much higher. I think anybody who managed to get up to the monastery has got to be almost superhuman.
The monastery remained out of reach. All conventional attacks had failed. But there would be one last startling attempt to outsmart the Germans using a forgotten path round the back.
Indian engineers had spent weeks turning a goat track into a road. They'd laid it stone by stone, concealing their activities behind camouflage screens. At dawn on the 19th of March, German sentries in a valley behind the monastery were puzzled to hear the sound of a tank. Suddenly, it appeared out of the gloom, followed by nearly 40 more, heading straight for the heart of the German position.
Robert Fretlaw, a 20-year-old German, rushed to repel the attack.
A tank, it's a very scary thing, I can assure you. Very, very scary when you hear them. And they seem to be louder at night times what they are during the day.
The Germans were caught completely off guard. Lesser defenders might have been shaken, but not the paras.
You have to have special equipment, which were anti-tank mines, which were like a dinner plate upside down. If the tank rolls over it, tips the plate, and then there's 70 pounds of dynamite under there, blows the tracks off.
The leading tank hit a mine and blew up.
And it blocked the road because it was only another track. And that's how they all got stuck behind one another. And then they were trying to get round it, and then eventually they were trying to get out. Then they were just picked off as they were trying to escape downhill again. And that was the whole episode with the New Zealand tanks trying to get up to the monastery.
The Allies had little to show for the thousands of lost lives. The survivors were weary and sick at heart, desperate for deliverance from their living hell. Alexander's cool was shaken by a terse message from Churchill, demanding to know why he kept throwing men against the monastery. Alexander was only too aware that another failure would not be tolerated. Things started to go his way with the arrival of spring. The flooded valleys began to dry out, and the river torrents subsided. At last, Alexander had time and weather on his side. And this time, he had a proper plan, drawn up here at Caserta by his Chief of Staff, John Harding. Alexander was persuaded that the secret of success lay in launching a mass offensive instead of mounting piecemeal attacks. Operation Diadem used for the first time the full strength of Alexander's two armies in Italy, the 5th and the 8th, concentrated on a front of just 20 miles. Alexander cloaked everything in secrecy and ordered the preparation of a real smoke screen at Cassino. Smoke generators like this were manhandled down to the river to mask the construction of 18 bridges. You light the fuse, and it belches out foul smoke for about 15 minutes. Hundreds of these would create a dense smoke screen that veiled the sun and blinded German observers.
The whole valley were covered in smoke, so that the Allied could bring their troops and refreshment and whatever they had to the front line. And it was terrible stuff. It used to make you sick when you had to breathe it in.
Hundreds of tanks were smuggled up to the front line. In their place were left dummy tanks made of wood and canvas, so that the Germans would not detect any movement. The Allies even managed to smuggle in the 50,000-strong Polish corps that the Germans thought was miles away. Only one commander was unhappy with Alexander's plan, Mark Clark. He felt angry because Alexander had shifted his 5th Army to the coastal sector, leaving Cassino under British control. He would never be master of Monte Cassino, a snub he wouldn't forget. But the monastery, which had cost so many lives, was still a target. There was one nation willing to accept the terrible challenge: the Poles. They'd lost their homeland in 1939, carved up between the Germans and the Russians. Now they wanted to remind the world of their existence. Richard Kierakowski of the Carpathian Regiment was 22 at Cassino.
We were preparing ourselves a long time for that encounter with Germans. We suffered enough during their occupation, and there was a time to pay back at this sort of thing. That was time we were fighting for our freedom.
The Poles, like the Americans and British before them, would attack along Snake's Head Ridge.
But he knew something was going to happen, because they used to cover the whole valley in fog every night after night after night after night. But that particular night, on the 11th of May, there was nothing. It was just clear, and it was awfully quiet.
As soon as 11 o'clock came, suddenly sky became white. 1,600 guns opened fire. It was a kind of something spectacular, you know.
All of a sudden, the whole sky lit up. It was just like somebody's throwing switches at the far end and lighting up. And this were the artillery. It sounded absolutely terrible. It was just like an earthquake, I should say, because the whole ground shakes when these grenades explode, because the whole mountain was rock.
And you look at that and you think, well, after that bombardment, there couldn't be anybody left on German side. But of course, it wasn't true.
And you just laid in your little foxhole and hope for the best.
After the bombardment, the attacks began. For the first time in the campaign, the Allies outnumbered the Germans 3-1. The battle would last for 7 days.
It's difficult to describe. Nobody wants to remember shouts and shooting and killing. That's something dreadful, which you do, and you do because you have to do. If you don't do, they will do that to you. But it's not pleasant when you're killing somebody. I remember, and I always live with that, when German was throwing hand grenade on me, and I shot him before he fell over his grenade, and the grenade exploded over him, and I was all covered in his blood. You see, still I'm dreaming about it, but it was necessary.
On the 6th day, the German commanders gave the order to retreat. The Gustav line had been broken some miles away from Cassino. German paratrooper Robert Fretlaw's escape route was back over Monastery Hill.
There was a big flash, and that's when I got wounded, and when I woke up, my left leg were damaged. They were like a balloon and so on, and I crawled into the first aid post in the monastery.
He was taken prisoner the following morning, as the Poles walked unopposed into the monastery. They raised a homemade flag. The Poles were victors of the monastery, but at a terrible price. On the slopes around lay more than 1,000 dead and dying men. The Poles had given everything for victory, but it was bittersweet. It was ultimately success in the valley that sealed the fate of the high ground. Once the Allies were across the rivers in strength, the German supply route up here was threatened, and Kesselring had no option but to pull back. That was always the real tragedy of Cassino. The monastery was a kind of mirage, an obsession that swallowed logic. As the Allies came close enough to touch it, it faded away. The muddy, bloody Gustav line was soon left far behind. It had cost the Allies some 100,000 casualties. The Germans suffered a similar loss. A few days later, Clark's troops broke out of the Anzio beachhead, ready to crush the retreating Germans like a nut in a cracker. But the antagonism between Alexander and Clark had one final, heartbreaking consequence. Clark, deprived of victory at Cassino, disobeyed Alexander's express wish to encircle the retreating Germans. He didn't close the net. Instead, he led his troops direct to Rome, letting Kesselring's men slip away. On the 4th of June, Clark made his triumphal entrance. While the citizens of Rome celebrated liberation, news came through of the Normandy landings 2 days later. Operation Diadem was overshadowed by Overlord, and suddenly Italy was back-page news. America pulled out its troops for another front. The Italian campaign should have ended here in Rome. But Clark's action allowed tens of thousands of Germans to escape to a new defense line north of the city, ensuring that the struggle over river and mountain would continue. But no account of weakness or ambition can diminish the contribution made by the men who earned their Italy stars the hard way. They endured appalling conditions, and they saw terrible sights. But by their courage and perseverance, they pinned down Germans who might have thwarted D-Day. The men here in Italy didn't win the war, but they helped make victory possible.
Looking round the mountains, in the mud and rain, there's lots of little crosses, some which bear no name. Blood, sweat and tears and toil are gone, the boys beneath them slumber on. They're your D-Day Dodgers who'll stay in Italy.
The aerial assault on Dresden in 1945 was the famous climax of the British bombing campaign against Germany. Bomber Command had become an awesome war machine, intent on destroying whole cities and their populations in a single night. But this is not how it was meant to be. The bombers had started the war aiming to hit only military targets without causing civilian casualties. This is the story of how Bomber Command was forced to reinvent itself, and the price that had to be paid in both German civilians and British aircrew.
55,000 members of Bomber Command died between 1939 and 1945, the heaviest loss rate of any single branch of the British Armed Forces. Dangerous at the time, controversial ever since. No specific medal was awarded for the bombing campaign, highlighting the ambivalence surrounding the young men who risked their lives nightly. Heroes to some, terror flyers to others.
I don't believe in hindsight at all. We did what we did at the time, and it had to be done.
If you dwelt on it, on a personal basis, then you couldn't do the job at all.
Up until the Second World War, Britain's bombers had been lulled into a false sense of superiority because they'd mainly flown against undefended targets. In 1939, Bomber Command saw itself at the cutting edge of modern war. The cavalry of the clouds, who would strike straight at the enemy military machine, virtually unopposed. But they were in for a terrible shock. Flying by day, the British bombers were an easy target for German defences. When they first encountered enemy fighters, on 2 raids in December 1939, 21 out of the 36 bombers and their crews failed to return. These loss rates were unsustainably high, and daylight raids were immediately abandoned. From now on, Bomber Command would fly by night, a task for which it was totally unprepared.
It was very tough. We were pioneering, we were sort of thrown in at the deep end. Nobody knew really what was happening. We had no sophisticated radar aids. Our navigation was done by looking over the side of the aircraft to try and see where we were. If it was 10 tenths cloud, that obviously was no good, and consequently you finished up miles away from where you intended to be.
At first, difficulties in the air were overshadowed by the great dramas unfolding elsewhere in the war. But the British Army's expulsion from Europe in the summer of 1940 left Bomber Command as the only force capable of taking the war directly to Germany.
Now the pressure was really on. The whole country looked to the bombers for success.
Night after night, anything up to 200 planes set out for Nazi Europe. Their targets were precision military and industrial objectives, such as oil plants, railway yards, aircraft factories and docks. The industry of the Ruhr Valley was singled out for special attention. Despite the difficulties of night flying, the campaign appeared to start well, and the propaganda films proclaimed Bomber Command's success.
Yes, there's a smasher right onto it. Caused a hell of a great big fire, buckets of smoke.
On the first anniversary of the outbreak of war, Churchill expressed confidence to his cabinet, saying, "The bombers alone provide the means of victory." Such confidence didn't last. This is the cabinet room in Churchill's underground headquarters beneath Whitehall. And by 1941, doubts about how well Bomber Command was really doing had begun to emerge down here. Germany had not merely failed to collapse, it was so healthy that it had gone on to invade Russia. And reconnaissance photographs suggested that much of the bombing propaganda might be rather wide of the mark. German bombers, on the other hand, were definitely hitting their targets. Britain had suffered terribly in the Blitz, and the nation burned. The government was worried. Germany seemed to be winning this war of aerial destruction. Lord Cherwell, one of Churchill's key scientific advisors, commissioned a civil servant named D.M. Butt to examine over 600 target photos taken during the summer of 1941. For a campaign supposedly based on precision bombing, his criteria were absurdly loose. Butt counted a dropped bomb as a hit if it fell within 5 miles of the target. Even by Butt's generous standards of what could be called a hit, the results were truly appalling. Over Germany as a whole, only 1 in 4 planes had hit their targets. In the crucial Ruhr Valley, centre of German industrial production, that proportion fell to as low as 1 in 15. And all this failure had been at a cost of some 700 British bombers and their crews.
The first time I lost a good pal, I went out into York determined to get absolutely blotto. I can't remember how much I drank, but I remained horribly stone cold sober. But after that, you just said, well, that's tough, and forgot them. You had to. I mean, each aircraft that didn't come back, that was 7 people missing. I mean, the night I was shot down, we lost 6 aircraft from our squadron. It's 42 people straight out like that. You can't bother to think about people who went.
Those who survived to fly again each found their own way of warding off fate.
We had a mascot, of course, in the aircraft, and I had a personal one. I had a little pink stuffed horse, which I kept in my pocket. And you found every member of our crew had something which they carried. And I even knew one chap who used to carry a pair of his girlfriend's knickers in his pocket. You never thought of that you wouldn't come back. It would never happen to you. It's the other bloke, not you. And you had confidence in the rest of the crew. And you knew very well that you would come back.
The shattering findings of the Butt Report forced Churchill to halt all raids on Germany at the end of 1941. Whitehall was in crisis. The one weapon that the British had to take the war to the enemy was virtually useless. As the crews rested, the politicians debated their future. The Army and Navy argued that Bomber Command's men and resources should be redirected to them. And for a time, it looked as if they might win the day. But Lord Cherwell had a new role for the Cavalry of the Clouds.
Cherwell had studied the effects of the Blitz on Britain, and he concluded that Bomber Command should give up trying to hit the factories and military bases of the German war machine. Its new target should be the German people.
Bomber Command itself had independently come to the same grim conclusion and was already gearing up for the new offensive.
This was area bombing, the priority targeting of whole cities, and specifically their populations, in the hope of breaking German morale. And it was the only policy that in 1942 Bomber Command had any hope of delivering. Yet its real aims remained vague. There were those who hoped for a moral collapse, while others believed that German industry would fold as its workforce was progressively dehoused. Underlying it all was the conviction that something vital would eventually collapse under the sheer weight of bombs.
Churchill restarted the bombing campaign early in 1942. Bomber Command would still have to fly occasional precision raids, but area bombing of cities was the real goal. Whatever the target, getting bombs to Germany was a daunting task.
I think you had to be an idiot if you didn't appreciate that it was dangerous to fly in a military airplane, apart from operating against an enemy, because if you just take a bomber, you're getting into an airplane that's loaded with high-octane aviation fuel, massive bombs, plus a lot of oxygen bottles with compressed oxygen in it.
I suppose probably the first time you did it, you might be a bit apprehensive, but I think my main concern always was don't let the other chaps down. I think it was the same with everybody. Whatever we were thinking, we kept to ourselves, and we didn't show it.
As well as a new policy, Bomber Command also had a new boss. Arthur Harris was appointed in February 1942. He embodied the latest ideas, believing the bomber to be a blunt weapon of war, only suitable for hitting large-scale targets. Eventually, he would earn the nickname Bomber Harris.
There cannot be a more controversial statue in the whole of London. Then, as now, Harris was a man who inspired extremes of emotion. He had something of the swaggering, ruthless manner of an Elizabethan buccaneer, with a dry wit and a very short fuse. His critics found him unrefined and rude, lacking in sensitivity, impatient, and almost totally inflexible. Yet he was regarded with great affection by his men, who identified with his earthy directness and his iron sense of purpose. He possessed the unwavering belief that heavy bombing of the enemy's cities could and would win the war.
Cometh the man, cometh the hour. Harris was the man with the resolution, the courage, the guts to drive on and build Bomber Command up into the tremendous force that it eventually became.
He was the best commander that we ever had. He was a super chap, and his first concern and his last concern was for us.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and 600 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
War in the air was dominated by technology, and the Germans had taken the lead in this arms race, in which small advances in equipment could make all the difference between victory and defeat. Fortunately for Harris, his force had been given priority for research and development after Dunkirk, and the new equipment was just beginning to come online.
It was a bomber that was built for the job. It was the best bomber we had by a long way. Beautifully designed. Most pilots, I think, would tell you that it was a pilot's dream. It was easy to fly. Even the engineers could fly it, so it had to be. Harris called it his jewel in the crown, and his sword, his flaming sword, I think he called it.
The Lancaster was the best of the new generation of four-engined heavy bombers, and quickly became the workhorse of Harris's force. It was capable of carrying huge bomb loads, eventually up to 10 tons, and taking more enemy fire without falling out of the sky, if you could get the fully loaded plane off the ground to start with.
On takeoff, the pilot usually operated the throttles himself and opened them up almost to full power, and the engineer's hand would be behind him, and then he would let go, and then the engineer pushed it up the rest of the way, so that he had both hands to haul the thing off. It was all brute force and hard work.
I spent most of my professional career walking about battlefields, but this is altogether different. What really strikes me is how difficult it would have been to bail out, especially if the aircraft was on fire or out of control. The main escape hatch is down there, by the bomb aimer's position, and it would have been a real scramble to get there, especially for the radio operator and the navigator. The men sitting up here at least had one another's proximity to sustain them. But they had one very lonely comrade. Tail End Charlie sat uncomfortably in the front line of Harris's war. He wore twice as much clothing as his companions, eventually electrically heated, because the outside temperature often fell to as little as -40 degrees centigrade. Matters weren't improved by the practice of taking out one of the perspex panels to improve visibility. The one advantage with being back here is that it was easy to bail out, always assuming that the turret still worked and that he had time to put on his parachute. All Tail End Charlie had to do was to spin his turret round and to fall backwards into the abyss. Armed with his new weapon and the policy for its use, Harris decided to open his campaign with a soft target. He explained later, "It seemed to me better to destroy a town of moderate industrial importance than to fail to destroy a large industrial city. I wanted my crews to be well-blooded, as they say in fox hunting, and to have the taste of success for a change."
The blooding took place on the 28th of March 1942 over the ancient coastal city of Lübeck, which had few defences. The wooden buildings burnt easily, destroying most of the old city centre. 312 people were killed and over 15,000 lost their homes. Another similar soft target, Rostock, was next to burn, further stoking the growing reputation and morale of Bomber Command.
The main reason why Lübeck and Rostock burnt so brightly was a step forward in the arms race. Harris had seen the value of fire while watching the Blitz himself. And from now on, the bulk of each bomb load consisted not of high explosive, but of incendiaries like this, little fire bombs, packed with phosphorus and scattered in their thousands. Between them, these bombs set fire to buildings and burst inside them to spread the flames ever more widely. The job now was to get as many as possible to the heart of Germany.
The biggest force that Bomber Command had sent out on a single raid so far had been 234. Harris now risked everything on one extraordinary raid to prove that bombing was the weapon of war.
Hamburg had been the first choice, but was cloudy overhead. The people of Cologne, on the other hand, had enjoyed a fine spring day under clear skies. Their city had been the second option after Hamburg. Now it was to be the target of the greatest air raid the world had yet seen.
"1,046 bombers would fly together from 52 airfields.
It was a huge gamble. If it went wrong, Harris could lose much of his force, and Bomber Command would be ruined for good.
The briefing officer said that a very experienced man had done a lot of sums, and he had come to the conclusion that there would only be 2 aircraft destroyed in a collision. And someone at the back said, "Yes, that's all very well, but which 2?" And there was a roar of laughter at that.
Light, medium and heavy bombers. Every available plane that could fly did fly. And many novice crews were plucked prematurely from their training units to make up the numbers. Only an hour from base, they approached the continent.
It's the stress factor that you can't imagine now that you had then crossing the enemy coast. From then on, you were at risk.
You just kept looking all the time. Your head kept going round. You did it on trains and things very often without thinking. You sort of automatically, if you were sort of drifting away, your head kept going round as though you were doing a search.
The 1,000 bombers were packed tightly together to burst through the defences and shorten the time over the target.
You obviously felt aircraft fly very, very close. You felt the draft as they went across the top of you, for instance. Without actually seeing them very often, you just felt that an aircraft had flown very, very near to you.
There were 3 aiming points at Cologne, each a mile apart, to ensure that a huge area of the city would be obliterated. Now the propaganda films had something real to boast about.
The aircraft from which these pictures were taken arrived over the target about halfway through the attack. Incendiaries have begun their work well. Large fires already are burning. It is difficult to judge how great the fires are, taken from a height of more than 20,000 feet. But the area covered by the film is about 6 square miles. You can judge from that how big some of those fires would be on the ground.
Hitler, fearing the effect the devastation could have on the nation's morale, ordered Cologne's inhabitants not to mention the raid outside the city on pain of death. Remarkably, as predicted, only 2 planes collided. In total, 40 aircraft were lost.
We may now shrink from such stark arithmetic, but at the time, that was not a bad return for German casualties of 469 killed, over 5,000 injured, and more than 45,000 made homeless. Yet even then, there were those who argued that such methods were morally unjustifiable. The strategist Basil Littlehart called them barbaric and unskilled. And later, George Bell, Bishop of Chichester, argued that there should be a better balance
between means employed and purpose achieved. Harris himself was unabashed.
When the storm bursts over Germany, they will look back to the days of Lübeck and Rostock and Cologne, as a man caught in the blasts of a hurricane will look back to the gentle zephyrs of last summer. There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see.
Harris now intensified the offensive, sending hundreds of crews out to pound Germany night after night. Each man had to do a standard tour of 30 raids before time off as an instructor, but with loss rates at around 5% per trip, the odds of making it through were hardly favourable. There'd never been a campaign quite like it. Aircrew didn't fly every evening, and on stand-down nights they enjoyed themselves in the pub, with games and sing-songs, and sometimes with girls who found it hard to say no to a boy who might be dead a day later. Some crews drank and womanized furiously, driving off to Lincoln, Nottingham, or even London for serious binges. From best bitter to fighters and flak, all in a long day's work.
It was a sort of Jekyll and Hyde existence, really. And it was funny to be, if you weren't on the night following, to be able to sort of just ride around your bike among the fields and think, well, it's not many hours since we were in another completely different world altogether. And you had to have two caps, one to enjoy yourself and one to get serious.
You were, as a crew, you were like a family. You were together the whole time. You were very intimate in everything you did. Each other's life was in your hands, as it were. And you all worked together as a team. And that's why you survived.
The ultimate test of a crew was in the last few minutes before they dropped their bomb load.
Well, the bombing run was one of the only times that you flew straight and level for a set period of time. And it was the most nerve-wracking part of the journey.
To fly towards a target which was literally ringed with cones of searchlights and the flak going up into where they all met. It was quite scary.
You just had to forget everything else. Take everything out of your mind except that little red spot or whatever it was down on the ground in front of you. And don't listen to anything, or just ignore everything. It was just between you and the pilot now. You just guided the pilot with curt orders, either left or right, or keep the darn thing steady or something like that, until your crosswires hit the actual marker that you were aiming at on the ground, and then away went the bombs, as simple as that.
And then you have to continue for a further period while the photograph is taken.
An onboard camera automatically photographed where the bombs hit, illuminated by a huge flash charge dropped at the same time. Without this photo, the raid would not count towards the 30-trip tour, and the crew would have to go again.
It was the most intense period during the whole trip. It was the ultimate thing that we had to do. I mean, that was it. That's what we were there for, to get that particular spot on the map.
Once everything had gone and the flash had gone, then it was usually the rear gunner who said, "Let's get the hell out of here," or something like that. It was a sort of a ritual that you did. And that was it.
While bombers and bombs had been improving, navigation technology lagged behind. Now the boffins came up with new radio and radar systems to help the bombers find their targets even in bad weather. The crews were improving too. From August 1942, an elite force called the Pathfinders was sent ahead to lay markers on the target or above the clouds that covered it for the main force to aim at.
Some of the Pathfinders used this plane, the de Havilland Mosquito, perhaps the only bomber to be held in higher affection than the Lancaster. What was special about the Mosquito is that it was made almost entirely of wood, bonded together in strips using a revolutionary secret glue.
While most of Britain's factories were hard at work making conventional metal bombers, the country's furniture and joinery shops could help make the Mosquito.
It was just like getting out of a truck into a sports car. It was gorgeous. It was fast, manoeuvrable, and, I mean, good gracious, what could catch them?
As well as pathfinding, Bomber Command's Mosquitoes specialized in reconnaissance and nuisance raids. High-flying and fast, they suffered few losses. Unlike the heavy bombers, whose casualties were increasing as the Germans improved their defenses. Stretching across northern Germany was now a formidable line of interconnected radar stations, searchlights, flak guns, and night fighters.
In most cases, we got them by surprise. We came from the dark below. And then, if you realize that it's an enemy plane, so you have, as a night fighter, you have to be very fast. Look, see, shoot. You know, it was within a split of seconds, and then get away.
If you could see a fighter first and fire on it first, invariably, I'll say invariably, but probably 8 times out of 10, it would clear off. It wouldn't attack you because they wanted to sit in dark, and they were no more heroes than we were.
If that didn't work, the only option was gut-wrenching aerobatics.
The order came from somebody, and it could be from anybody in the crew who happened to spot the fighter wherever he was. Corkscrew port or starboard, go. And immediately you went right over on a wing over until your wings were almost vertical, and at the same time straight down as hard as you could go. And when the airspeed reached somewhere around 350, 400, the wings were supposed to drop off at 300, but they never did. You rolled off the other way and then climbed as steep as you could up on your tail until you were almost stalling, and then round again and down again. So you actually went through the sky like that. It was like a corkscrew.
However good the crews were becoming, Bomber Command's losses were now surpassing 10,000 men per year. Britain desperately needed another breakthrough in the arms race.
The next step forward was simple but ingenious. Thousands of strips of aluminium foil, codenamed Window, were released from bombers. They were picked up by German radar and fooled it into thinking that the aluminium cloud was another bomber. Window was simple, cheap to produce, and it gave the British a decisive edge.
It was first used in July 1943 on Hamburg, and the defense was hopelessly confused with a mass of bombers, some real and some illusory.
When we got there, I couldn't believe what I saw because the searchlights were aimlessly waffling about, and some of them were even shining parallel to the ground. And so we knew immediately that this blooming simple stuff, Window, was working.
I could see Hamburg, I could see the immense fire, and I also could see, closer to me, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4-engine planes. And I told my controller, please let me go. I see that he did not have any reception. He did not have any radar reception, so I wanted to go there. No, you cannot go there, you have to stay here. I asked him again, ask Berlin, I see them. Well, I was not allowed to go. All the radars by all controllers, including the anti-aircrafts, were jammed, seriously jammed by windows.
With the enemy rendered defenseless, the 800 bombers enjoyed an easy run to the target. The damage was so severe that the Germans coined a new word, firestorm. It was a freak condition caused by the exceptionally dry summer and the closeness of the buildings, in which a vortex of fire swept the city, annihilating everything in its path. Not only were key industrial targets destroyed, but some 30,000 civilians perished.
At last, Harris's policy of area bombing had reached its full, terrible potential. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, wrote, "6 more Hamburgs and the war's over." Harris believed that he was bringing Germany to its knees. His next, and he hoped final target, would be Berlin. He bragged that once he'd destroyed the capital of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, the war would be won.
The battle for Berlin began on the 18th of November 1943. But it was immediately clear that it was going to be no Hamburg.
I think I can say that it was the Berlin ones which were the worst because of the distance and of the enormity of the target and of the defences.
Berlin is more than 600 miles away from Britain, half as far again as Bomber Command's normal targets. The German defences were also learning how to unscramble the confusion caused by window. And the winter of 1943-44 was one of the coldest on record.
We had icing problems on our aircraft out over the North Sea. We were picking up ice, and once you start to get ice on your wings, it gets thicker and thicker. You can almost see it building. And once it reaches a certain stage, of course, it destroys the lift on your aircraft, and down you go.
Those who eventually reached Berlin found that it was the most heavily defended place on Earth.
Flak towers like this bristled with guns, given radar direction from another tower nearby. They were virtually indestructible. This one has survived the bombing, Russian attacks at the war's end, and post-war attempts at demolition. Flak gave a terrifying greeting to the bomber stream over the German capital.
There was barrage flak over a target, which could hit you or not hit you, and there was predicted flak. Now the predicted flak was connected to their radar, as was their master beam.
They were blue in colour as opposed to the others, which were yellow. They just went up and stood still, and then they just flicked straight onto an aircraft.
If that locked onto you, you knew you were in for trouble. But you cannot fly straight and level for any length of time, covered by searchlights, and think you're going to get away with it, because you're it now, you're their target. They're rubbing their hands because everything is pointing at you now. The radar's onto you, and they can't miss. You got a small flash, not like you see on the movies, a big bang, all that, just a small flash, and then the smoke. But of course, out of that smoke, you've got hundreds of chunks of hot metal, some of which I still have inside me. In 10 seconds, you can get cut to ribbons by a shrapnel, I can tell you. That's how we met our demise. Nice to imagine that's how practically everybody who was shot down met their demise, because either the airplane was totally destroyed in the end, I've seen them just fall out of the sky. Great chunk of burning metal and bits falling off it, and the searchlights falling right down to the ground. That was the way of things.
The Battle of Berlin was turning against the British. Devastation here on the ground was severe, but the weather and the layout of the buildings meant that there was no firestorm. Although 1/5 of Berliners lost their homes, their will was not broken. Far from it. As with Britain during the Blitz, air attack largely stiffened their resolve. Salvation for Harris and for Bomber Command over Berlin came from an unlikely quarter. Early in 1944, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe, was nearly ready. And General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, wanted bomber support. He pulled Bomber Command off Berlin and sent it to join its American counterpart, the US Army Air Force, over occupied France.
Harris fiercely resisted this move away from Germany. He was convinced that the invasion of Normandy was unnecessary, and his men not up to the job of precision support.
Harris didn't think we would be capable of doing it. It wasn't what heavy bombers were designed for. In any case, as far as Harris was concerned, German cities were what we were after, not little targets on the ground somewhere else. But much to his surprise, we got off very well.
The bombers' main targets were the railways that kept German forces supplied, and the guns and radar stations on the coast, which they hit by day with devastating accuracy. Fighters flying from their bases in England kept the German defences at bay. On D-Day itself, June the 6th, part of Bomber Command pulverised the landing sites in advance of the Armada. Other planes flew diversionary raids to fool the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to be further up the coast. After D-Day, they were put to the ultimate test, bombing German positions just in front of their own men.
We sometimes operated within 800 yards of the forward troops, which is not very much when you're bombing from 10 and 12,000 feet. We felt sorry for them. They weren't going to get bacon, eggs and clean sheets to sleep in.
Bomber Command's contribution to Operation Overlord had been a huge success. After years of trial and error, it had finally become what it was supposed to be, a precision fighting force. Casualties were down too, halved since the Battle of Berlin. The great irony for Bomber Harris was that his force's finest hour came when it was being used in what he regarded as a sideshow.
In September 1944, Bomber Command returned to Harris's control, and he resumed his personal crusade. Germany's defences were now crippled by lack of fuel and outgunned by new long-range Allied fighters. In the last 3 months of 1944, more bombs were dropped than in the whole of 1943. The campaign reached its climax on the 13th of February 1945 with Dresden. Churchill asked Harris to destroy the city because it lay in the path of the advancing Russians. This would show Stalin that the Western Allies were still vigorously prosecuting the war. In terms of area bombing, it was the perfect raid. 40 square miles of the city blazed in a firestorm that outburned even Hamburg. Some 50,000 people are thought to have been killed. Harris had delivered his terrible whirlwind. Faced with the horrors of Dresden, Churchill now questioned the area bombing campaign.
As the Germans seized the propaganda opportunities of massive civilian casualties, including hospital patients and refugees, he penned an official minute to the Chiefs of Staff. He wrote, It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing German cities, simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Harris was insulted, and his written reply to Churchill questioned the Prime Minister's change of heart. His words demonstrate his extraordinary commitment to total war. Attacks on cities are strategically justified in so much as they tend to shorten the war and so preserve the lives of Allied soldiers. I personally do not regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. Under pressure from the Chiefs of Staff, Churchill withdrew his original critical minute. But the area bombing campaign against Germany was over.
No one said anything particularly. I mean, I don't think we ever discussed the raids amongst ourselves. Perhaps an odd comment here and there, but I don't think we ever settled down and talked about it. I think the fact that we'd been there and got back was quite enough.
After the war, Harris was not offered a suitable RAF appointment and left Britain for South Africa. He and his men became and remain the target of fierce criticism concerning the morality of their campaign.
I mean, we knew we were probably killing a lot of civilians, but I mean, when you've been on the receiving end of a lot of bombs and you've seen fires and people have been blown to pieces and this death and destruction, the feeling was that we've got to give them the same.
You were on your way home, you'd done what you're supposed to do, and you never thought about what was happening on the ground. I mean, if you did, and you thought about it deeply, then you couldn't do the job. I know it sounds heartless and cruel, but war is.
There are still dozens of long-abandoned airfields like this, with nature gradually reclaiming runway and perimeter track. They provide enduring evidence of the great effort that went into the bombing campaign. But what did it achieve? There's no easy answer. It didn't close down German industry, whose production peaked in 1944. But the bombing did prevent it from rising to even greater heights and forced the diversion of massive military resources to the defense of the Reich. The air offensive also lifted British morale at a time when there was no other way of taking the war to Germany. And it helped pave the way for the Allied invasion of Europe. Yet the cost was enormous in both materials and men. 55,000 aircrew died, almost half of those that flew. In weighing success and failure, we sometimes forget that the young men who risked and so often lost their lives did it for us.